Hi guys, and welcome to Drive Yogi. As you probably know by now, the purpose of this channel is to take yoga back to a traditional, perennial, spiritual context. A lot of people today associate yoga with a system of flexibility and physical fitness. So what I want to do with this channel is to explain and contextualize yoga as a very, very old spiritual Indo-European practice. So the theme for this video is hierarchy and the importance of hierarchy in spiritual systems and in spiritual practice. That means that I'm going to explain to you why hierarchy is both important in your own practice to understand the fundament that hierarchy plays in spirituality, and also to inform you about why a lot of spiritual systems are deeply structurally hierarchical. In the modern Western world, we tend to have a negative view on hierarchy. We tend to view it as a remnant of the past, something oppressive, which comes from the Marxist narrative that the past is simply a history about certain groups with power oppressing other groups without power, which of course is an extremely reductive and false view of history. What I want to talk about today is why we tend to think that in the West and how that seeps into our understanding of spirituality. I see a big problem. I see a lot of problems with modern spiritual communities in the West, but one of the biggest problems I see is that spirituality becomes ego-driven, which means that spirituality is something done purely by the ego, and the ego is viewed as the crown and a certainer of whether a spiritual practice is effective. This leads to a situation where people are practicing whatever makes them feel good and comfortable at any given time. And as soon as the practice challenges the ego, you switch practice, you switch teacher, or you switch systems. And that leads to a complete disregard for the importance of discipline in spiritual practice and a lack of understanding that it is when the practice becomes hard to do that you're really challenging the ego and thus expanding your perspective of the world. So it's important to understand that hierarchy helps you ascertain whether your ego is taking charge or not. That's one of the most fundamental roles of the teacher, which I talked about in my video about the guru-shishya, or the student-teacher relationship. And practicing spiritual sadhana, having a sadhana that is like that, where you change systems, every 3 weeks when something is not fitting or where something doesn't feel comfy anymore, that doesn't really lead anywhere because it doesn't challenge the ego. And challenging the ego is necessary in order to grow spiritually, because only by challenging the ego can you see the ego or the personality for what it is and therefore grow beyond it and expand it. It's also very common to hear that people are not religious, they're spiritual. And that usually means that they're practicing this wish-washy combination of a little bit of Buddhism when it fits, a little bit of shamanism, a little bit of paganism, and they were having this kind of like mixture of completely incompatible worldviews and paradigms, and they're calling it spirituality. And this is purely like something driven by what is fashionable in the spiritual community, in the New Age community at any given moment. Right now, the most fashionable things are shamanism and tantra, which means that you have a lot of tantric shamanism retreats, which is kind of like it's pure invention. It's mixing systems that is completely incompatible, that are separated by hundreds of years and thousands of miles of distance, into this kind of like wishy-washy, feel-good spirituality, well-being business thing to help you make money. Okay, that was enough shade throwing for today. Let's now look at the importance of hierarchy. Any spiritual system, when you get into it, is following certain fundamental dynamics. Let's look at yoga as an example, because I teach yoga. So if you look at the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Patanjali says that there are 8 steps towards union with the divine, and those steps are yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyani, samadhi. Those 8 steps follow a hierarchical structure where you start to subdue certain aspects of yourself when you practice yama. Yama means restraint. So when you're practicing yama, you're taking charge and control from a level of consciousness and conscience over your animalistic instinctual tendencies. So you're exercising restraint in your life in order to be more capable in your practice. And this leads me to another very important point to understand, because a lot of people think that austerity, that tapas, as we call it in the yogic lore, means that you lose freedom. And a lot of people tell me that, why can't you be a little bit more free? Because I have quite a lot of practice on my schedule every day. I practice a lot. And I want to say that, and very, very clearly make it understood, that discipline does not lead to bondage. It's quite the opposite. It's only if you have discipline that you're truly free. Because discipline means that you, from the level of consciousness, is in charge of your life. If you have discipline, say we develop mental discipline in yoga through dharana, through concentration, that means that you are in charge of your thought patterns instead of the other way around. And if your thoughts are in charge of you, that means that you are being led and swayed in life by blind patterns of thinking that are not your own, but simply a result of past experiences. So discipline is the fundament for freedom. This is very important to understand. When you're engaging in physical training, you're not doing that to put bondage on yourself. You're doing it to increase your freedom. Because if your body is in a state of fitness, that means you can do more, you can be more resistant to disease, you can live longer, you can live healthier, you can live happier. So discipline is the fundament of freedom. That is really, really important to understand. The first paradox of philosophy, as we label it in a certain order. Anyways, hierarchy is also vital because it protects students. When you look at modern spiritual communities, and especially the communities such as the New Tantra, who now have been shown to abuse students sexually at all levels of the organization, these structures are very often flat. So there's no structure there. There's kind of like everybody is their own teacher and everybody's kind of like invited to speak in this kind of like democratization of the spirituality. And when there's no hierarchy, you also lose something else, which is really important, and that's accountability. If there is hierarchy, you know who is accountable. If there is hierarchy, you know where power resides and where to go for teaching, for guidance. If that's not visible, if power is invisible, that will lead to, people with certain narcissistic tendency seizing that power instead, which can be quite dangerous, as we see in modern spiritual communities that have been shown and exposed for what they actually do. Having a hierarchical structure to a spiritual system as well kind of protects the teaching, because certain teachings are advanced, certain practices are advanced and should not be practiced by beginners. That's something we see a lot of in the West as well, is that there's no such thing as advanced practices and everybody should just experiment with everything all the time. That can be dangerous to not do that. If a practice is labeled advanced by your teacher or by a tradition, that means that the practice is advanced, and it's dangerous to undertake that practice without the necessary groundwork having been done. So an hierarchical structure as well protects the dharma. It protects the teaching from being misused and misunderstood, because certain esoteric teachings are impossible to understand if you don't have the fundamental intellectual and spiritual training before you undertake them. That goes for both like philosophical teachings, but also certain practices. They won't have effect, and if they have effect, that effect would be quite destructive to you, because you don't have the circuitry to handle these practices. And I'm speaking here as somebody who has done advanced practices without having been properly prepared. That was very damaging, so do not do that. It's also really important to understand, and now I'm talking more at the esoteric level, that the spiritual dimension of reality is hierarchical by nature. You can look at this as a cosmic law. Look at the solar system, for example. You have the unmoving star that everything is ordered around. The sun is the center and everything else revolves around the sun. It's a hierarchical system. If you look at the body, our hearts and our lungs, the organs that preserves us, are protected by rib cages, which again are protected by muscle tissue, fibers, skin, etc., etc. So you can say that our very being, nature itself, is ordered in a hierarchical fashion. Hierarchies are something that is applicable at all levels of reality, both spiritually and in the material world. So when a spiritual system, a spiritual tradition, is ordered in a certain hierarchical fashion, that also reflects the hierarchical ordering of the spiritual world, which allows for a certain descent of spiritual power into that lineage. Now I'm talking at the esoteric level, but I think some of you will understand what I'm talking about here as well. A spiritual system, in order to be truly, truly effective, needs to be a reflection of a spiritual reality. And hierarchy is a spiritual reality. Not in hierarchy of power, that allows for certain people to abuse other people, but in a hierarchy of being, if you know what I'm talking about, if you can understand that, in hierarchy of being, where certain states of being are more protected, they're higher up, and certain states of being are ordered lower down. So that was what I wanted to say to you all today. I hope the video made sense. Please let me know in the comments below whether you liked it or not. Thank you for watching. May all beings be happy and free of suffering.